Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and change makers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. David Woodruff has been a key figure in some of the largest and most successful fundraising efforts in healthcare and higher education. He oversaw the $1.5 billion campaign for the Third Century of Massachusetts General Hospital, and then directed a record-setting $6 billion campaign for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. David joined Marts Lundy as a consulting partner following his retirement as Associate Vice President and COO of Resource Development at MIT this month. In this episode, we speak with him about his journey, lessons learned, and opportunities for engaging the rising generation of donors. Not much traveling these days. The last 2 years,
Yeah.
I haven't gotten on a plane since right before March 12th.
I'm in the same boat, and my first time on a plane will be in April. Basically for pleasure. So back into the swing of things, hopefully.
Where are you going?
So my wife and I really enjoy visiting national parks, and the springtime is such a lush time to visit the desert. And so we're going to New Mexico, Western Texas, Big Bend National Park, areas that we actually haven't seen. They're somewhat remote. Hitting this, of course, as sort of a driving time with gas prices, it's going to be more expensive than I counted on, but still a welcome break and a great time of the year for a beautiful part of the country.
But you do enjoy the outdoors. Very
much so, yes. That's been a mainstay of my life, through my youth and just sort of getting outside. And in fact, it was a motivation when I was sort of looking at how I would go to college, what I would study. And it was at one point it was meteorology. And then it moved to civil engineering and environmental engineering. So the sort of passion for the outside but also the environment is sort of been in my portfolio for a long time. And of course, going out and seeing some of the natural beauty of this country is something that is a project everyone should start sooner rather than later, because it's a pretty big country to try to see it all.
Right.
But it's magnificent. And that was sort of one of our family, the goals along the way.
Where did that start for you? Because you mentioned meteorology and then the rest of the natural environment. And I know that when I was young, I remember on a big camping trip, lying on a picnic table and looking at the stars in Heber City, Utah, because it was so different from where I was from. It was so clear and bright, but it was definitely looking far away instead of right here at home. Where did your interest come with nature in general? And why did you start by looking at the stars? And then how did you start by looking around you?
Well, it was more looking at the clouds than the stars. So, but I would say that my background in scouting probably had something to do with it. I remember sort of a moment in time where I was at a summer camp and they called everyone into the dining hall to watch this particular event in July of 1969, which is landing on the moon. And of course, at whatever age I was then, maybe 15 or 16, it seemed, oh, this is cool, but I didn't really absorb the impact of what that was. But it was sort of a moment in time that said, wow, all this work of research science is so critical to making things like this happen. And I look back at that very favorably, sort of a moment. And then, in fact, years later, working at MIT, I got to meet Buzz Aldrin. And so it sort of came full circle as sort of meeting the second man on the moon.
Wow.
He's an MIT graduate. And so it was just, sort of a wonderful kind of connection of those two things. But bit by bit, I've always been this person that has been curious about things, how things work. And it sort of directed me a little bit more toward engineering. And so I ended up majoring in civil and environmental engineering. I like to think that although I don't do as much of the engineering practice as I used to, I've maintained my civility in what I do, and therefore the sort of notion of problem solving or sort of coming to terms with solutions in business and so on. Engineering background is somewhat helpful in this, even with respect to fundraising and philanthropy. And I had a professor at Babson College in the MBA program I was in who was a former engineer, and he moved over to teach organizational management. He said, I gave up engineering because I wanted to work on the harder problems. The harder problems were around people. And I sort of remember that when you think about what it takes to build organizations, make them able to perform, deliver, and sustain results, hire good people, all of that became my runway forward. And it's something that I've been able to apply to the different work in fundraising and development shops that I've worked in.
And even before we go there, don't take us out of that early time yet, because you did decide to go and study civil engineering right there. I don't think most people would describe a place like M&T as their hometown school, but you're from, is it Newton that you're?
Yeah, so 9 miles away from, all my friends were sort of traveling great distance. I get on basically the subway to get here from time to time. I did actually, my parents drove me in on the first day, but it didn't take very long. So I knew it wasn't a commuting environment. I treated it like, okay, this is college and so on. It just happens to be local, and I have an advantage as I know the area. But so I have my whole career has sort of been based around the Charles River in Boston, if you know the geography. And so almost every job I've held has been within distance of the river, and it sort of over time has sort of become a constant for me. And even in Newton, the Charles River flows through there. So it's sort of symbolic kind of thing. But yes, I was very fortunate to I think find be accepted at MIT and actually eventually be part of the workforce there to propel its mission in the world. And I didn't have to travel very far to get there.
So was that the Charles River running through it? Was that an accident or by design? I mean,
no fly fishing going on in the Charles River. No, it's sort of a joke that I've sort of told myself. But over time, in fact, at my recent retirement party, the theme was the Charles River, and it has been. I still look at it with the same sort of awe, and both from a sort of environmental point of view, but also as a sort of a symbolic piece for me.
I know it's important to people there, but not being from there, I don't understand the significance of it. What does a place like that mean to the people who live there, to you?
Well, I mean, I think it's a timelessness, and the river is there. Always reliable, flowing, and occasionally it freezes over, and but it's a natural beauty, and you think about it's sort of how many people see it every day and touch it, and maybe not think about it in the way that I have, but it has become sort of a North Star, if you will, locally. This is just the way that I have adopted it as part of my life.
Right. Well, there must be a sense of history about it, too, because not only a lot of different things happening there today, but they have over time. And I know what's the old line that you can never step in the same river twice?
Well, I believe it was named after a King of England, Charles, who was probably not a popular person, in time. And there was some debate going on in the current royal family as to whether Prince Charles would maintain that name as king or pick something else, but he was somewhat unnerved by the kind of way Charles I, may have treated people over time. Who knows what will happen in that respect? But yeah, there is history. There is all kinds of it played a huge role in the actual building of Boston, and it was before there was a dam at the end of the river. It was tidal, and it would just empty and be a mud flat. But it was during that a time when they brought in fill from the suburbs that they built Boston's Back Bay, and eventually they put a dam there, and it's actually where the real estate became available for MIT's campus. So MIT, has a long 2 miles of prime view of the river everywhere you go. So it does it's played a significant role for the whole architecture of Boston.
Right. Now, you said you had studied civil engineering there, and I guess the early part of your career, because I've always known you in your world of fundraising. Right. But you started in engineering itself. Was it water engineering, and what was that
water
about?
Resources engineering? Yes. So maybe connecting the dots here a little bit, a bit more, and worked for a Boston-based company. Camp Dresser and McKee as a bench engineer and environmental engineer, and did that 5 years prior to actually working and transitioning to work professionally at MIT. So
what enticed you to make this switch into fundraising, besides working for your alma mater, I guess? But
yeah, no, it wasn't the heartstrings of the alma mater. Many people think that it probably played some role and sort of facilitated my decision. It was my curiosity, and in the world of engineering, you get assigned to projects. You work on things, generally a couple of things at a time, and I had an appetite for greater multitasking. This is pre-internet, Jay. This is not where the information society is today in terms of what's accessible in terms of learning. But what kind of experiential activity did I want in my career? And I was tempted toward something that was sort of multi-client in nature, where I could be a facilitator. And rather than call it fundraising, I adopted a kind of strategy for business development, and I joined MIT's Industrial Liaison Program, which at the time was part of MIT's fundraising arm, but it wasn't a main feature of philanthropy. It was more business development, connecting faculty with research interests, ideas that are generated out of the institution to industrial applications, and sort of doing that pairing and matchmaking. It became, it's a real part of MIT's culture, that sort of industrial connection, and it's actually just turning 75 years old, and so it's got quite a longevity in terms of its staying power, and the formula has been very successful for MIT. At some point, I did, and it's there with good mentors, good bosses, that I actually broadened not only my technical curiosity, but my understanding of other cultures. I did a lot of work working with Japanese companies in sort of this modeling of these connections, working with American firms as well. But really, and all of this sort of in the public domain of research. But I had a very interesting mentor who was the vice president at the time that I joined MIT. He may not have thought of himself as my mentor. I sort of adopted him along the way. He was a survivor of the Bataan Death March in World War II, an MIT graduate, and dedicated his life after World War II. And he was in captivity for most of the war. I think it was 6 months in after 1941 that he and he was prisoner of war for all of that time. Came back to MIT and committed himself to really wanting to build closer relationships with Japan. Now, there's no central casting that I know of that would ever sort of predict someone to do that after that experience.
Right.
But it was his way of dealing with it. And I think, what I learned from that experience as he took me under his wing and others along the way, it is an important, it's an important obligation to build relationships internationally, to understand other cultures and to go beyond the kind of challenges from time to time of war. This is his view, and he was very private about it. He didn't talk about it a lot, and it was in later years he opened up a little bit more about it. But it was a pivotal experience, and I, of course, was green in my 20s, saying I have only things to learn about this experience, and it changed my life in terms of my outlook and understanding of the world. And at that point in time, it became a fast-growing market economically in Asia, and it soon became an entry point to discussions about corporate philanthropy and involvement. And that's sort of how I got into that sort of broadening of that work. But it is the most frequently asked question of me, Jay, in terms of how do you make this leap from this sort of way into something like this. And as I've learned from Sam, my vice president at the time, you can be pulled along and helped in the process of building careers, and he did that for me. And then after that, it was more kind of understanding how philanthropy and fundraising actually work. So I was sort of a latecomer to that aspect of business development. I think along the way, that's where I met you on a conference on international fundraising, and it was out in Utah. I think we were presenting on a panel, and fortunately, we've stayed somewhat in touch over the years.
Now, that was a very interesting time, because it seemed like the world of international fundraising, anyway, was very scattered and in fits and starts. That what you were doing at MIT was remarkable, not only for the people and their commitment to it and for working with an institution like MIT to get it done, but that it was being done at all. That there were many institutions then and now that take a very narrow view or almost a myopic view, and they do quite well there, serving the people who are close to them or within the same country. During your time working with the international aspect of fundraising, have you seen a change from those days when we first met to today? Kind of a greater interest in collaboration, not just at institutions like MIT, but more broadly across higher education and philanthropy in general?
Well, so many things have changed since those earlier days. The world has caught up in a lot of ways. The investment in educational systems across the world, especially in Asia, China, Japan, has changed, and sort of the look, the sort of emulating MIT as a model has sort of, that was sort of one aspect of an incentive for building partnerships. And now I think it can be safely said that there is much more of a collaborative attitude in terms of joint work, joint research, quality participants in all ranges of science, engineering, technology, and other disciplines. And a very, very important aspect of this is that the appetite for students to have that international exposure has really blossomed over time. But the geopolitics have certainly been a challenge in the last decade, I would say, and there are certain aspects of that perhaps both help or hinder, ways of working. There are still major differences in cultures of philanthropy in terms of how much one might expect a return on an investment. I don't like to frame it that way, but at some point you have to do the calculations to say how much is it worth. MIT has always had that standing to be able to advance relationships wherever they may be, wherever the best relationships might exist, and on a world-based alumni base. So not all institutions are positioned to operate as effectively on that scale, and it is a large commitment of time and resources. And so I do understand the choices that have to be made, but certainly times are more complicated, more sensitive. Perhaps a lot more interesting in some ways, but still important. I think. But if you are a global institution, if you proclaim to be that, then you have to be global. You have to be in the world, and you have to keep making the effort. Because I don't think it. I think re-entry into the world is pretty hard if you retreat.
Is that the sequence too for institutions to first make the decision that they want to be part of the world, and then second to make the longer term commitment to doing something with alumni, friends, whatever they are, supporters around the world?
I think it's one way to frame it. I don't think it's the only way, and I think it's a decision that's individual for each institution, depending on the circumstances, depending on the motivations, the volunteers, the assets that might be in place to make it happen. But there's been a lot of experimentation over the years. Institutions from campuses abroad to joint programs and research, and it really does take a long view for making things happen. There are no quick hits these days, and I think part of what I learned, especially internationally and in Japan originally, is the importance of relationship building as sort of fundamental, and garnering that trust. It isn't an opportunity you can just sort of breeze in and breeze out these days. So it does take a real strategic commitment these days, and I suspect if we were doing it all over again these days, a lot more rigor would be applied to the kind of thought process necessarily, given the sort of complexities, but also the opportunities.
Now, did that world of international fundraising, was that a piece of that later campaign? Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. First of all, for those who don't know, there was a massive campaign at MIT during your tenure there, but you've been there in two different stints. You left and worked obviously at Harvard, which we talked about, and at Mass General, but then returned to MIT. When was that campaign? What was its scale, and what was the part that you really played a role in with that campaign? So
I was involved in two campaigns at MIT. In the first stint, it was sort of breaking the $1 billion barrier in terms of goals, and it was a $1.5 billion goal, and culminating in that were several international relationships. But that was actually a campaign that demonstrated a switch from that prior corporate connection, dominated corporate fundraising to the world of individual giving. It was quite pivotal in terms of that, and that was successful at demonstrating that yes, MIT could also do as its peers were doing in engaging alumni in support of the institution even more broadly than it had in the past. And that was exciting. It was exciting to build new systems, but we didn't start from the long-term culture that sometimes exists on other campuses of individual giving. I went away for 10 years. Actually, in that process was helped the MGH campaign, Mass General Hospital campaign, 1.5 billion, their 200th anniversary campaign. That was successful, and then was recruited back to MIT to be part of the process that put together originally a $5 billion campaign, but that was switched to a $6 billion campaign along the way. That just concluded in June.
Those are all big, obviously big campaigns. As you said, you broke that $1 billion ceiling with that first one of the three, and that was a big number. It still is. Most institutions would be very reluctant to entertain any number like that for a whole variety of reasons. But it does seem like it's attainable now for organizations that have made that commitment over time, have that constituency, have a project, have the vision. But all of that comes from these campaigns. What was it like when you think back to that $1.5 billion campaign to try and make a goal like that? Did it seem like that was just... Did you approach it almost personally in the same way you would any kind of project where we need to get the pieces in place, first study them, what is it that's possible, and then get the proper sequence? Or was there a lot of hope involved in that?
Well, it's never completely, according to plan. And I of course, was at that stage. I was more involved in major gift work, and I wasn't lying awake at night thinking about what's the next principal gift that's going to be transformational. And I think the those that were sort of active at sort of building that whole process were looking at all of the contributions to the campaign that were possible. But it was really a test of confidence, a test of using practices in the field and sort of saying, yeah, we can do this. But it did rally some important strategic initiative planning, to make conversations possible. And it was at a time when major renovations to the MIT campus were underway and appealing. And so there were lots of ways to test the ideas, to broaden the prospect base, something more commensurate with, what we thought was the capacity for giving, and to hire good staff. And, those three things are, one of those things is going to limit your fundraising at any time. If you don't have the ideas or case, if you don't have the prospects, or if you don't have the staff, or when I say staff, the volunteers, the people that drive the fundraising conversation, one of those things needs to be it may limit your fundraising at any given time. So the strategy really was, building towards sustainability, once you have a campaign like that, and making sure that you're not going to just stop and wait for other things to happen, but keep going. So I think, and as we've seen in lots of campaigns across the country, that's how it plays out. That it's a stepping stone to the next thing, and the next ambitious thing comes along with more ideas and more impactful philanthropy invitations for donors to become engaged, and the institutions that can put those pieces together will be the ones that will thrive. And I think going to the five, that was a daunting proposition, but the same questions existed about in the same building blocks about what you need to do, just at a different scale. We'll see. I think conventional wisdom will change over time about how far you can just continue the expansion of campaigns, and probably entering a more creative innovative, rich phase after these levels for some institutions, because prospect bases are not indefinite, and they're not infinite in terms of their size. And so one of the real pride points of the MIT campaign in this last go around was the attraction of friends to the mission, to going beyond the sort of alumni, the very extremely loyal alumni, but saying, okay, how can friends be attracted to this mission? Those that have a passion to want to apply themselves or solve problems in the world. How can we make that story and connection to MIT happen? And I think that's what this campaign demonstrated.
And that's distinct, I guess, from the kind of the corporate sponsorship piece, which was an earlier facet of, for example, international fundraising, like it was done out at Stanford or places like that, where they did attract a lot of friends, but those were corporate friends. You're talking about a different kind of friend here, aren't you? I mean, people who might have been successful in business, but who have a heart for whatever the mission is or the project is at MIT.
Exactly right. And I think it's a matter of whereas you don't have the you can't look back and depend on the sort of 4 years or period of time that someone was a student as sort of early cultivation and the sort of ingrained knowledge of the institution. You have to build a trust in the institution, but you first have to identify where the passions overlap, and you have to build that trust, and you have to have trust in the ability to carry it out. And I think that's where that was part of the message of the campaign, that it was a campaign for a better world, not only looking for our own needs, but saying, let's apply this to some of the world's greatest challenges.
Now, I know that there are a couple of challenges on the outside of that. One is public perception about institutions, large institutions. MIT and Harvard are easy for people to love and to loathe just because of their scale and their reputations. That it's easy for people to say, well, it's easy for Harvard to raise money because it's Harvard. That kind of thing is pretty unfair, but it's also very common. But there's another aspect which is more, it seems to be more current. And that's a feeling that institutions shouldn't have so much money warehoused. We hear that in discussions about everything from donor advised funds to private endowments or endowments for private institutions. I'm sure that must have come up when you're thinking of bigger and bigger goals. One aspect is how much money can we raise and what are we raising for? But another one is this perception, and not just public perception, but I'm sure when you meet with individual donors, does MIT really need more money? How did you navigate that discussion? Is that one that you had internally? And how did you navigate it for yourself?
Well, I think it's about demonstrating impact. And I don't think, we're very understanding of how that perception might be out there. There is a lot of work, I think, that we did to kind of inform our donor base about how the finances of research work. That it isn't a lot of warehoused money. It's about endowments are made from contributions from philanthropy, and they're very much restricted in terms of their use. So I think our approach was really to demonstrate the larger possibilities of impact of solutions that could be helpful to society worldwide, but also to say side by side, here's how this finances work, and it is not about having extra money lying around. I mean that's not what this campaign is for. It's to allow the sort of leverage of MIT's ability to really focus on those world's greatest challenges. And I think many believed and trusted MIT for its ability. But I do understand, that the perception could be as you described, for not just for MIT, but for large institutions.
Did that, though, ever give you pause, or any of the people you spoke with? Because donors, even who have very, very significant resources, are thinking about these things themselves. If to use the international example, there were individuals in China who had amassed significant wealth, and they were thinking about the projects which were meaningful to them, which included projects at places like MIT or MIT's vision, but also might have been with addressing some form of whatever it is, need for infrastructure development or poverty alleviation or 100 other things which might be right there close to where they were from or where they live. So I'm sure that was somewhere in there. So besides making sure that people saw the value, the merit, and the impact, how did you think about those other issues, or how did you help others to think about them?
Well, I think this is where this was an opportunity, and there, many of the projects that MIT undertakes are focused on collaborative efforts that actually could result in improving conditions in the world, and this is certainly one of the important prongs of the student experience these days. It isn't just about a study abroad, going. It's about immersing into the social fabric, or having some social impact. And students routinely work for nonprofits and for global institutions that want to make a difference. So I think our student base, was really was really helpful in sort of demonstrating that impact and ability for MIT to be in the conversation. But as I tried to imply earlier, the earlier kind of disparity in terms of where other educational systems or someone was in when I started this work and where it is now, it is so ripe for collaborative and kind of joint work. And I think that actually is very motivational for donors and who've seen that in play. When I worked at Harvard, it was at the School of Public Health, and it was clearly a social mandate to really bring science to bear on the international situation of health, and I'm so glad for that experience, given what we've just been through, to have had that exposure as to how these systems work. But it really was really allowing solutions and collaborations to exist around the world. And what I found fascinating was seeing shifting from perhaps a technology view of a place like MIT to the public health lens, and seeing the impact really on the human terms in some of the important projects underway globally.
That's important, and just to go back to that, of course, when you were working there, that was before the Chan gift, is that right, or was that during that time? Okay,
that was before,
and that was an extraordinary gift, but it was one of a whole bunch of gifts that occurred there, and I know also with the Mass General campaign, which were a different. That was again a higher order of giving for things that had visible impact beyond just individual patient care, for example, or something like that. It was and hitting a goal like that was very profound. I don't know if there were any other $1 billion plus campaigns for hospital or hospital systems at that point.
Well, at that point, it was among the largest in Boston. There probably were some higher numbers in New York based hospitals, but it was the Mass General campaign was a celebration of 200 years. It was its bicentennial, and I kind of joked when I came back to work at MIT that MIT was perhaps the youngest institution of the last three that I've been at, but it was sort of an amazing confidence booster about creating a culture of philanthropy, around that. And I learned a lot in terms of the transition about what motivates donors to give to healthcare. And it was, beyond what was sort of the sort of grateful patient notion, which is still very, very much alive and well and an important mainstay of that, but really the gratitude that's part of that. It was remarkable, and yet at the root of why people give is about that notion to give back and make things better for future generations. And it was the platform for that MGH campaign was great, and they're often running on an even higher campaign at this point. So I stay in touch with them, and they're doing great things.
And then you made your way back to MIT. So I know I'm going kind of out of sequence here, but you went back to MIT. What brought you back, besides obviously a place that you enjoyed working? Was it the campaign itself, or what was it, the role? How did you decide to come back?
Well, I go back to what I found. And a lot of fundraisers have this. I kind of call it the fork in the road kind of reality check. Are you the individual contributor, or are you the manager, leader? And I had shifted, in part at Harvard to at least a split of the individual contributor, so leading a small development officer as leading a small development office, but also having to manage that and be accountable for the organizational growth. And I found myself much more attracted to the value-added proposition of sort of organizational management. And again, back to what my Babson professor at the time sort of implied, working with people, making the machinery of philanthropy and fundraising understood as a business proposition, understood within the context of a bigger organization. How to bring the pieces to bear, how to build the strategy. And this is I think, where it's become acutely important over the years. And this opportunity at MIT was one. I should also preface this that the MGH opportunity I had was the first of its kind to be a COO of a development shop. And I was attracted by that. And then similarly, my position at MIT was the COO of the development office. And how to mobilize, how to get this, how to engineer, if you will, this sort of complexity of an organization that needs to be raising money at a certain reliable clip each year, and how to really really that sense and help in the messaging and bringing the pieces together to meet those goals. So that's what brought me back. It was quite an exciting opportunity, and they were thinking big, which was
and that goal was already in mind, or did you develop that goal once you had arrived?
That goal was under discussion, in the early time of my arrival, but there had already been some campaign planning underway.
Okay.
And then sort of internal kind of negotiations, and $5 billion became the first goal. And I love talking about your trajectory as you make your way through this, but I know that some people will be just angry if I don't ask you a couple of nuts and bolts questions about this, because so few have lived through a campaign of that scale. So can you give us kind of just a couple of numbers so we can get a picture of what that's like? If you were starting at 5 and you decided in the end at 6, what kind of prospect pool are you talking about? Now we're getting the arcana of fundraising, but what kind of prospect pool, how many staff, how many volunteers, what did you need to make that happen, especially from the COO perspective? So, I don't want to say that there is a strict formula. I mean, we sort of operated within guidelines of things we knew about, what gift officers are able to do in their role. And I think it was we became right-sized to this operating goal of $500 million a year, and that was sort of my way of looking at this is take this down into a sort of an annual production level and make that sustainable. Well, $500 $500 million a year is, 1 to 2 million a day. And so to think of that, and I know those are awfully big numbers, but I think that's sort of a persuasive way to think about the sort of regular resources that you need to ensure a pipeline large enough to yield those kind of results. And of course, in our world, MIT was very blessed with some, very large, large donors, and those donors exist all over the world. And we've seen, many of these campaigns are propelled by the very large gifts. There was certainly, some of that. But from my point of view, from a COO, I wanted to ensure sustainability, that we are, making sure that we're growing a pipeline of donors that make lifelong commitments to the institution, or can, should they choose, over time, and grow them into 6 and 7 figure gifts. I think a 7-figure gift, even the lowest possible 7-figure gift, is a lot of money for someone to make. And I've been especially aware of that, because I do a lot of work with smaller nonprofits. In my work through AFP, I was president of the Massachusetts chapter, and was able to I didn't go in with any sort of notion that something of the size of MIT would be transferable to the kind of mindset of smaller nonprofits. I was actually more hungry to hear the stories, the storytelling of passion, where small smaller organizations could make that difference, and how they felt about it, how they treated their donors. Because again, it goes back to really what motivates people to give, and it isn't just about the scale. MIT's got a big portfolio of things to want to accomplish, so it does. Having more resources makes that possible, and it certainly, the campaign scaled to something that could deliver on a regular basis, on a recurring basis, that kind of fundraising. And I think that's the important legacy of a campaign. If you reach some sustainability over time that you can then depend on, and where your cash is coming from, where your resources are coming from, that's just smarter business.
So what was the hardest part of it for you?
I think I don't want to say it's the hardest, but it's sort of the one of the things we and this is not unique to MIT by any means, but there are people that have a notion of fundraising as sort of either something that's either very easy or extremely difficult, and it's very easy if it's sort of oversimplified, and yet we all know that in our profession it's an art and a science, and in the sort of logic part of what people will do is only go so far. It's about really conveying a sense of how the business works. And what was the hardest part was making sure that people understood the emotional intelligence that's needed to build relationships with donors and connect, and especially in our community of friends that really have adopted MIT as a place to make a gift without sort of a prior affiliation, perhaps. And it's fundraising is not for everyone. I'm glad I do it because I really enjoy, sharing an experience with a donor that says, can we think together about how you could execute on your passion, how you could make a difference, and how we might work together and really kind of make that match work into something productive. The last 2 years have been a real challenge, I think, in terms of what our ability to connect in the ways that we were sort of depended on, the sort of personalization. I sort of coined this phrase of, having empathy in two dimensions. So working on this screen as a way. I mean, we all kind of understood the efficiency, perhaps witnessed some gains in our ability to connect with people, more people than may have traditionally offered appointments in their office. On the other hand, the jury's still out as to what we may have lost in the process here in terms of how we build relationships. And I think coming out of COVID, the organizations are going to have to think, well, how do we regain that confidence in relationship building that existed over time, especially over these donors that you want to preserve over a long period of time. So we're all hit by that, and fortunately, we did very well. But so how to make new friends in that mode was sort of the open question, and I think that's something that a lot of organizations are having to deal with.
I do want to ask you a tough question about the friends before we do kind of take a final look at what just happened, as well as what's next for you. And this is a difficult question, I think, for everyone in fundraising, particularly for people who have been at institutions where friends are an important part of our work. And that is that we don't always know everything about friends when we first meet them. You've worked at two institutions, and I'm closely affiliated with another that had support from Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm just asking this as person to person, not on behalf of any institution affiliations either of us might have. But I'm wondering, what is the lesson that you have taken from how institutions generally have addressed the issue about how to make sure that we know who we want to take support from, how we apply those principles in practice? As a COO, I'm sure you've had to do that with many things that no one's ever heard about. And then how can institutions generally think about how to build their base of support, friends, all the people who care and have a heart for the work we do, without opening themselves up to danger, either for themselves or for their constituents, the people they serve?
Well, you've identified a real challenge, and I think the understanding of what happened was sort of studied greatly. I was part of the committee that looked into processes and so on that would sort of address the sort of future of how we would evaluate and sort of look at challenges, if you will, and the production of due diligence and so on has become an important part of our process. So we feel that was addressed properly, and I think many lessons have sort of been taken from that, but also safeguards, and that's actually reassuring in many ways that out of that process grew a sort of a stronger recognition of the institutional values that need to be in place, and how are they being upheld. And we learned that everything matters. Everything matters in terms of reputation, in terms of what we do, and there's nothing casual about it. So I think that institutions will need to adopt greater standards of scrutiny and sort of understanding about where values collide and where they overlap with donors. And I think MIT has come out in a stronger place as a result of that experience. But it is a great question, Jay, and it will be important for all institutions to embrace it.
And is there some kind of advice that you might give to smaller institutions which may not have had to or decided to undertake that process of review and think about what are not only the values but we have, but how are we applying them in our gifts and policies and procedures, that boring stuff that's so essential to a campaign. If you're a small institution somewhere in the middle of the country or overseas, is there guidance that they can look to, or 2 or 3 things that you would suggest that they do?
I don't know if I could boil it down to that. I mean, it really there are not unlimited resources to build infrastructure around this evaluation. But I think being sure that your institutions are asking the right questions and confirm this sort of understanding of donor behavior and sort of understanding the risk that that there may be. And I think this will translate in different scales, just according to different sizes. I don't have a prescription for what it takes to on a small basis, but there are certainly ways in which institutions can have access to knowledge about past behavior or associations in a way that is much more secure than they may have done in the past.
Right. And I know this is a challenge for all of us. So thank you for making that extraordinary effort to answer a very difficult question in a way that applies to lots of people when their situations are quite different from one another. This is something that isn't new either. I mean, when we first met all those years ago, I remember people talked often about the Sasakawa gifts and their complexity. And that had to do with not gifts being made at that point in time, but to that man's father and the things that he had done 20 and 30 years, 40 years prior. So there's a knowledge of these things is important, but there's no, as you said, there's no easy prescription. And that's probably true also for the future. Now, you were just talking about what we've lived through with COVID, and we could talk for hours about that, and we shouldn't. But what I do want to ask you is if you think that as we look forward, with the generations that are rising, and you've talked about this in other fora, where we have this rising, not just the millennials who are here, I mean, are already such a big part of fundraising and philanthropy, but also Gen Z. And I don't really like these terms, but they're just easy then to talk about things. With the rising generation of donors, are there different things that we need to be thinking about, or different ways we need to be behaving so they're truly our partners, that we're not just using them as ATM machines, which I know MIT hasn't done much of that, but many institutions have treated donors not always as well as they could have been. Are there things that this rising generation expects or should be able to expect from us that we can do, a way that we can build that culture of philanthropy together so it's more effective and successful for everyone?
So, you raised some solid points. It wasn't too long ago that we were talking about millennials in this way. Well,
right.
Millennials have done a lot of growing up and advancing in age and are a different stage, perhaps in their professions and so on. And there was this temptation because of the sort of change of attitude. This is my opinion anyway, that I observed that the expectation of sort of loyalty giving, was sort of, the way that fundraising was approached. And that may have been true for baby boomers, but Gen X sort of squeezed in there, and then millennials. We saw a change. We saw a change in really striving toward impact, defining the way in which people can make a difference, and not only by finance, but by financing it, but by getting directly involved. And so I think the volunteer landscape has changed and opened. I think this is even more prevalent as we look at the current generation in college, the Generation Z. They're going to expect to be much more engaged and involved in the work and the decision making, in the strategy. And I think we're seeing this in the the sort of blossoming of even more interest in trying to solve some of these global problems. Let's face it; they're not inheriting the Earth in a sort of the best possible shape that other generations could have handed it to it. So it stands to reason that there may be a lot of motivation to be directly involved to help steer what goes on in terms of problem solving and be directly involved. So institutions need to welcome that in some open way to acknowledge that and be patient. There is a point in time when people are perhaps have better means to make large gifts, and it isn't in the early 20s generally. It's going to take a lifetime of nurturing and so on. Be patient as that process grows, but keep them engaged and keep them active. And it means shops have to excuse me, heighten their broaden their communication strategies. Right now, institutions, higher ed, we're talking to 5 generations simultaneously. And each has their own way of receiving information, processing it, their own ideas of how to be engaged. I recall that print media was sort of going to die, and it was going to all be electronic. And
right.
We've got more investment in print media, in electronic media, everything, so many channels. And how do you make sense of all of that? How do you measure the impact of that? That's going to be important. But development shops now are going to need creative communications professionals and storytellers to really kind of make sure that the messaging gets through to the right individuals, and be patient, and things will happen.
Right. And you've used that word engagement, and I know before in another setting, you said maybe we need to define that differently or better define it. Do you want to take a stab at that? Because I hear that word used all over the place and nobody ever says what it means. What does engagement mean?
So I do think that there's a spectrum of engagement, and I'd like to think that engagement, means that I really feel I've sort of crossed over to I feel very strongly and supportive of an institution or a cause in some way. I've committed myself to in that way. I may not agree with everything that goes on, but I'm actively thinking about it and want to do something about it. And how do I get to that point beyond just sort of an affiliation that labels me as sort of part of that organization as either a member or an alum or something like that? How do I get to that engaged point of view? And that takes effort on both sides. And I think it used to be simple metric of capacity and inclination, and it really wasn't given this sort of study that engagement now happens. And so it's hard to know. I think organizations are struggling with how to interpret what engagement actually results in some ways. Is it a measure of philanthropy? Is it a measure of contacts, number of visits? I mean, it is hard to apply some of those things. We know it when we see it, and I think we have to point out and celebrate when that engagement happens. In positive ways, at least even privately with the donors that are fully engaged. But to the earlier point, making channels, making opportunities available for input, that will further engagement. I don't think anyone has unlocked the kind of formula for engagement yet. Everyone's sort of having to look at that right now.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like you're viewing this as very individual for the person on the receiving end of whatever we're trying to do to listen and respond to the things that matter to them.
Which perception becomes reality, right? If
Right.
I perceive myself as engaged, then I'm engaged. But I can't be called engaged by someone else necessarily. Have the same kind of resonance.
Right. These labels can be pretty inexact if they're not based around people's own identity and how they identify themselves and their interests rather than what we think. And speaking of which, you've just retired from MIT, which is pretty extraordinary. But I know that's maybe just a capstone to a campaign. But you're not done. You've got a lot of things that you are engaged in. And so, where's life taking you at this point? Are you back on the road for bicycling? Where's your curiosity taking you in this next phase?
So I'm still dealing with that 1 week out of retirement, and I expect that what I valuing most is time to kind of think about it in a way that can be helpful. I'm still actively engaged with AFP here in the Boston area. I enjoy this sort of aspect of education, particularly newcomers to the field, and love hearing the stories of impact. Love, talking about challenges that organizations are having in terms of their mission, their brand, and their effectiveness in fundraising. I will be doing some consulting, but I'm not inclined at this moment to kind of launch headstrong into that. I do want to be spending more time with the family, being back to those outdoors and on the bicycle and being engaged in that way with other things that I now have time for. But staying active, I think, and connected to the work of philanthropy in general, especially on a national kind of platform, I think it's important. I think it's important for me, I should say. First of all, it's so interesting to watch, the swings in how philanthropy makes a difference. We're going to be witnessing, another large scale movement to support Ukraine. Year over year, there's been societal response, and America's culture of philanthropy is second to none, and it's such an interesting component of our society, more than we perhaps give credit for sometimes, or recognition for. But I want to stay engaged in making sure that organizations understand how it can work to social good.
The Philanthropy Masterminds podcast is underwritten by DonorSearch, the world leader in donor intelligence solutions. Our producer is Jack Frost. Our theme music is Be My Remedy, composed and performed by House of Say. You can subscribe to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find blogs, webcasts, and CFRE accredited webinars with our featured masterminds at DonorSearch.net, or check the show notes and descriptions.